The moment I walked into my district manager's office and saw the old man from the Tim Hortons sitting across the desk in a pressed suit with a company lanyard around his neck, I think my heart actually stopped for a second. He looked over at me with the same calm eyes I remembered from that rainy Tuesday morning, and I genuinely had no idea what to say. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. I had been working at a mid-sized logistics company called Carver & Reed out of Mississauga for about 3 years at that point. I started as a junior coordinator right out of college, and I'd worked my way up to senior operations coordinator by the time any of this happened. It wasn't a glamorous job, but I was good at it. I knew the shipping routes, I knew the vendors, I knew which drivers to call when things went sideways on a Friday afternoon. My supervisor, a woman named Patricia, had actually pulled me aside 6 months earlier and mentioned that a team lead position was being discussed internally. She said my name had come up in a positive way. I held on to that like it meant something. Then a new regional director came in. His name was Derek Holloway. He transferred up from the Toronto office sometime in late February, and from the first week, something felt off. He had this way of walking into a room like he was already disappointed by what he found there. He spoke to the junior staff the way you'd speak to someone who had just spilled something on your carpet, not quite yelling, but with this flat, controlled irritation that made you feel small without him ever raising his voice. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. New role, new city, probably a lot of pressure from above. I told myself he'd settle in. He didn't settle in. By the end of March, he had already restructured how daily reports were submitted, which added about 40 minutes to everyone's morning. He started CCing himself on emails that had nothing to do with him, and then following up on those emails with corrections for things that weren't actually wrong. He reassigned 2 accounts I had managed for over 2 years to a colleague who had been with the company for 4 months without any explanation. When I asked Patricia about it, she looked uncomfortable and said it was a regional decision. The thing that bothered me the most was how he did it. It was never one big thing you could point to. It was 100 small things. A comment in a team meeting about how certain processes had become a bit too comfortable. A performance review note that said I was resistant to change, which I only heard about secondhand. An email he sent to the whole floor reminding everyone that seniority was not the same as merit. Sent on a day when I had just successfully rerouted 3 shipments around a bridge closure and saved the company a significant delay. I started arriving earlier and leaving later just to stay ahead of whatever the next thing would be. The Tim Hortons on the corner of Hurontario and Britannia was part of my routine. I stopped there every morning on the way in, ordered a medium dark roast and a toasted bagel with cream cheese, and sat in my car for about 10 minutes before heading into the building. It was the only part of my day that felt entirely mine. On that particular Tuesday in April, it was raining. That cold, gray kind of April rain that doesn't feel like spring is coming. It feels like winter changed its mind. I had just gotten my coffee and was heading back toward the door when I noticed an older man at the counter. He looked to be in his early 70s, I'd say, neatly dressed in a gray wool jacket. The kind that looks like it's been well kept for years rather than recently bought. He had a small paper bag on the counter and a large tea, and the young woman at the cash was gently explaining that his card had been declined. He tried it again. Declined again. He patted his jacket pocket and then his other jacket pocket, and I could see it on his face. That particular kind of embarrassment that comes when something goes wrong in public that shouldn't have gone wrong. Not panic. Just a quiet, composed mortification. He smiled at the girl behind the counter and said something like, "I'm very sorry about this. I'm not sure what's happened." And she smiled back and said it was no problem, but there was a small lineup forming behind him and you could feel the awkwardness settling in. I stepped up beside him and handed the cashier my card before I really thought it through. "I've got it," I said. He turned and looked at me. He had steady gray eyes and a very straight posture for a man his age. "That's very kind of you," he said. "But please, you don't need to do that." "It's just tea," I said. "Please don't worry about it." He looked at me for a moment. Not in a strange way, just attentive, like he was actually seeing me. And then he nodded and said, "Thank you. That's genuinely kind." I smiled and said it was nothing, and then I walked out because I didn't want to make it a whole thing. I got in my car, drank my coffee, and drove to work. I didn't think about it again. The weeks after that were hard in a way that was difficult to describe to people who hadn't experienced it. Derek started holding one-on-ones that weren't really one-on-ones. They were these sit-down meetings where he would lay out a list of development areas for me that shifted every time we met. In March, it was communication style. In April, it was project prioritization. By May, it was something he called strategic alignment, which, as far as I could tell, meant agreeing with Derek. I kept doing my job well. I know I did because the actual outcomes were there. On-time delivery rates on my accounts were consistently above 92%. I had a vendor relationship with a carrier out of Hamilton that I had built over 2 years that was saving the company money every single quarter. My colleagues came to me when they had problems because they knew I would help them work through it. None of that seemed to matter. In late May, Derek called me into his office and told me the team lead position was being offered to someone else. He said it without any particular expression, the way you'd tell someone the meeting room had been double booked. He said the decision was based on overall leadership potential and that he hoped I would take it as motivation to grow. I sat in that chair, and I kept my face very still, and I said I understood, and thank you for letting me know. I walked back to my desk, sat down, opened my laptop, and started checking shipping confirmations because I did not know what else to do with my hands. Patricia came by my desk about an hour later. She didn't say anything about the meeting. She just put a coffee down beside my keyboard, a Tim Hortons cup, which meant she had gone out specifically, and said, "You're one of the best people on this floor. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Then she went back to her office. I held it together until I got to my car at the end of the day. Then I cried for about 10 minutes, called my sister, and then pulled myself together and drove home. I want to be honest about something. I thought about quitting. More than once. I updated my resume. I had a phone screen with a company in Brampton that seemed promising, but I had worked hard to build what I had at Carver and Reed, and something in me refused to let Derek Holloway be the reason I walked away from it. Maybe that was stubbornness. Probably it was, but it kept me going in. The morning everything changed was a Thursday in early June. I got a message from Patricia just after 9 asking if I could come by her office. Her tone in the message was neutral, which was how she wrote when she was being careful. I closed my laptop, smoothed my jacket, and walked down the hallway thinking that whatever this was, I would handle it the way I had handled everything else. Calmly and professionally and without making it worse. I turned the handle and opened the door. Patricia was at her desk. Derek was standing to one side of the room, which I registered first. And then I registered the other person in the room, sitting in the chair across from Patricia's desk. And something in my chest simply went still. It was the man from the Tim Hortons. He was wearing a charcoal suit now instead of the wool jacket, and the company lanyard was around his neck, and he looked entirely at ease, in a way that made the room feel like it belonged to him. He turned when I came in, and I saw recognition in his face before I fully processed what I was seeing. Patricia said, "Come in and close the door, please." Her voice was measured. I closed the door. I stood there. I was working very hard to keep my expression neutral. Patricia said, "I'd like you to meet Mr. Gerald Foss. Gerald is the founder of Carver and Reed." The founder. I want to tell you, I had some graceful reaction to this. I didn't. I stood there for probably 3 full seconds saying nothing, which felt like much longer. And then I said, "It's nice to meet you," which was the most inadequate sentence I had ever produced. He stood and extended his hand and said, "It's nice to meet you properly. I believe we've already met briefly under slightly different circumstances." His handshake was firm and unhurried. Derek, I noticed, had gone very quiet. What I found out later, what Patricia explained to me after the fact, was that Gerald Foss had largely stepped back from day-to-day operations about 4 years earlier when he handed management responsibilities to a board of directors. He was still the majority owner, but he had intentionally removed himself from the operational chain so the company could function without him hovering over it. He did, however, make a point of visiting regional offices a few times a year, incognito, not to catch anyone doing something wrong, just, as he later put it, to see what the company actually felt like from the outside. He had lost his wallet that morning. He'd discovered it missing after he'd already ordered his tea, and his phone was at the hotel. He'd left it charging and stepped out for a walk before the day started. He was entirely unbothered by the card situation, he said. But he noticed how I handled it, and he noticed more specifically that I walked out without turning around to see if he had watched me do it. He asked the girl at the counter if she knew who I was. She didn't. He noticed the Carver and Reed parking sticker on my car through the window and followed up from there. I did not know any of this was happening. The meeting that morning was not long. Gerald asked me several questions about my role, about specific projects I had worked on, about how I would describe the current operational climate on the floor. I answered honestly. I did not complain. I described what I had observed factually, without editorializing, because I had no idea what was happening, and I was trying very hard not to say anything I couldn't take back. At one point, Gerald asked me directly what I thought the biggest obstacle to team performance was in our current structure. I was aware that Derek was standing 3 feet away. I thought about Patricia putting a coffee on my desk. I thought about the team lead position. I thought about 18 months of development areas that moved every time I came close to meeting them. I said, I think there are some structural decisions being made above the team level that aren't fully informed by what's actually happening on the floor. And I think when the people closest to the work don't have a clear path to be heard, you lose institutional knowledge quietly. And by the time anyone notices, it's already left the building. Gerald looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded. He turned to Patricia and said, Thank you. I'd like a few minutes with Derek. He looked at me and said, Would you mind waiting outside? I'd like to speak with you again before I leave. I went and stood in the hallway. My hands were shaking very slightly, which I found both annoying and understandable. A colleague walked by and asked if I was okay, and I said yes, just waiting on a meeting, and she nodded and continued on. I stood there for about 12 minutes. I could not hear anything through the door. Derek left the office first. He did not look at me. He walked down the hallway with his eyes forward and turned the corner, and I did not see him again for the rest of that day. Patricia opened the door and gestured me back in. Gerald was still seated. He had a notepad open, but he wasn't writing anything. He looked up when I came in and said, Sit down, please. I sat. He said, I've been building this company for 26 years. I started it because I believed that logistics done well was actually about relationships, with vendors, with clients, with the people doing the work. I've watched that idea hold up in good years, and not hold up in years where we brought in the wrong people. He paused. I've asked Patricia to move forward with the team lead structure we originally planned. I understand your name was part of that conversation before it was redirected. I said, yes. He said, I'd like to know if that's still something you're interested in. I said it was. He said it was. He said, good. Patricia will follow up with the formal process. I want it done properly, not as a correction. He said the last part evenly, like a note to himself. Then he looked at me and said, I want to say something that has nothing to do with any of that. What you did that morning, you didn't wait to see if I noticed. You just did it, and you left. That's rarer than people think. I've been paying attention to people my whole career, and that kind of thing is genuinely rare. I didn't know what to say. I said, it was just tea. He said, I know. That's exactly why it matters. He stood and we shook hands again. He thanked Patricia and left. I sat there for about 4 seconds after the door closed, and then Patricia looked at me from across her desk and said very calmly, So, do you want to get lunch today or do you need a minute? I laughed. It came out a little unsteady, but it was real. I said, I need about 30 seconds and then I want a very large sandwich. We went to the deli on the next block. We sat across from a window that looked out onto a parking lot filling up with lunchtime traffic, and I ate half a clubhouse and Patricia had her usual turkey on whole grain, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with work for almost an hour. The team lead role was made official 3 weeks later. Patricia ran the process exactly as Gerald had asked, formal interviews, documented evaluation, the whole thing, and I came through it the right way, which mattered to me more than I expected it to. I didn't want it handed to me. I wanted to earn it in a room where it was actually being assessed fairly. Derek was reassigned to a different division. I don't know the details and I didn't ask. It wasn't something I spent much time thinking about. What I did spend time thinking about was something my grandmother used to say in that plain, matter-of-fact way she had. She used to say that your character is what you do when there's no one watching and nothing in it for you. I heard it so many times growing up that it stopped landing. It became one of those sayings you file away and stop actually hearing. I think about it differently now. That morning at Tim Hortons, I was running late and it was raining and I had a hard day ahead of me and I was tired in the particular way that comes from months of trying to hold something together that keeps being pulled apart. The last thing on my mind was whether my small gesture would end up meaning anything at all. It didn't occur to me to wonder. I wasn't building anything. I just saw someone who needed a hand for 30 seconds and I happened to be standing there. And that's exactly what I want to hold on to. Not the outcome, not the promotion, not the vindication, not Derek walking down the hallway without looking at me. All of that faded quickly into just being the job, the work, the day-to-day of a new role with new responsibilities. What I want to hold on to is the feeling of walking out of that Tim Hortons without turning around, of doing something small and clean and not needing it to be witnessed, of being, for one unremarkable Tuesday morning, exactly the person my grandmother always believed I was capable of being. That diner on her Ontario is still there. I stop in most mornings on the way to work. Same medium dark roast, same toasted bagel, the same counter and the same gray April light when the season takes its time coming. Some mornings I think about Gerald Foss and his wool jacket and his very steady eyes, and I think about how many people probably walked past him that morning and never looked up from their phones. I'm glad I looked up. I'm glad I walked out without turning around. I've thought a lot about what actually happened that morning, and the more I sit with it, the more I think the Tim Hortons moment wasn't the cause of anything. It was just a moment that made something already true about me visible to the right person at the right time. That's how I understand it now, not as luck. Not as the universe rewarding good behavior on some kind of cosmic scoreboard, but as a simple, honest chain of events. Gerald Foss saw something real because there was something real to see. If I had been the kind of person who only acted decently when someone was watching, he would have seen that instead. You can't fake the fact that you walked away without turning around. Either you do or you don't. What I keep coming back to is the question of who I was being during those 18 months under Derek's management. Because I didn't know Gerald existed. I didn't know there was anyone paying attention. I showed up every day and I did my work well, and I treated people fairly, and I kept my integrity intact, even when it was genuinely costly, even when it looked like none of it was going to matter. That wasn't strategy. It was just the only way I knew how to operate, and I think that's the thing worth holding on to, because the outcome could have been completely different and the choice would still have been the right one. There's something I want to say about the hard stretch of it. The months when Derek was reassigning my accounts and writing ambiguous notes in my reviews, and I was updating my resume at night. I didn't feel wise during that period. I felt tired and frustrated, and I cried in my car more than once. Resilience isn't a feeling. It's a decision you make again every morning when you'd rather not. It's arriving early anyway. It's doing the work well anyway. It's being decent to people anyway, not because you believe it will be rewarded, but because the alternative is becoming someone you don't recognize. I think the most important thing I did in that whole story had nothing to do with Gerald Foss. It was the moment Patricia put a coffee on my desk and I let it mean something. I let someone's quiet act of solidarity land. I didn't dismiss it or power through it stoically. I felt it. And then I kept going. That's the only kind of strength I believe in, the kind that knows it needs people, that stays soft enough to be moved and firm enough to stay in the game. What I want to leave you with is this: the choices you make when there is nothing obvious at stake, when no one is grading you, when no camera is rolling, when the only thing in it for you is the small private satisfaction of having done right by someone. Those choices are not wasted. They are the most accurate record of who you actually are, and who you actually are has a way of becoming visible, eventually, to exactly the people who need to see it. Gerald didn't change my life because I bought him a tea. He reflected back to me a version of myself that I had been quietly building for years without fully knowing it. That's the only story I know how to tell honestly, and I think it's enough.